My name is Sarah, and I'm a paranormal investigator. I've explored some of the most haunted places in the world, but the abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town still gives me nightmares. The asylum had been closed down for years after reports of mistreatment and abuse of patients. But there were also rumors of paranormal activity, which is what drew me and my team to the building. As soon as we entered the asylum, we could feel the negative energy in the air. The hallways were long and dimly lit, and there was a sense of heaviness that seemed to permeate every inch of the building. We started our investigation on the ground floor, which was mostly empty aside from a few pieces of furniture that had been left behind. But as we made our way up to the higher floors, things started to get more intense. We heard strange noises coming from behind closed doors, like banging and scratching. And whenever we tried to investigate, the sounds would stop. But the real terror came when we entered one of the patient rooms on the third floor. The room was filled with old, rusty beds and medical equipment that looked like it was from a different era. As we were examining the room, we heard a low groaning sound coming from one of the beds. At first, we thought it might have been a trapped animal, but as we got closer, we could see that something else was going on. The bed was shaking violently, and there was an eerie glow emanating from it. We knew that we had stumbled upon something truly sinister. We immediately tried to leave the room, but the door had been locked from the outside. We were trapped in the room with whatever was causing the disturbance. As we huddled together, trying to figure out what to do, the groaning sound grew louder and more intense. And then, out of nowhere, a ghostly figure appeared before us. It was a woman, dressed in the same hospital gown that the patients had worn. Her face was contorted in pain, and she was holding out her hand as if she was begging for help. But before we could do anything, the woman disappeared, and we were left alone in the room once again. We eventually managed to escape the room, but the experience left us all shaken to our core. The abandoned asylum had lived up to its reputation as one of the most haunted places in the world, and we knew that we would never forget the terrifying encounter that we had experienced there. This exploring abandoned places horror story had been the most intense experience of my paranormal investigation career, and I still get chills down my spine when I think about that ghostly figure in the patient room. My name is Emily, and I love exploring abandoned places. I find it thrilling to walk through buildings that have been abandoned for years, imagining what they used to be like when they were filled with people. But one particular experience will stick with me for the rest of my life. It was a warm summer evening when my friends and I decided to explore an abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town. The asylum had been closed down for years, but the building still stood tall and foreboding, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. We parked our car on the side of the road and made our way to the fence, looking for a way in. We eventually found a gap in the fence and climbed through, making our way into the overgrown courtyard. The asylum was made up of several buildings, but we decided to start with the main building, which was the largest and most imposing. We pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside. The inside of the building was dark and musty, with a faint smell of decay. The walls were peeling and covered in graffiti, and the floors were littered with debris. We each had a flashlight, but the beams were weak and barely illuminated the space in front of us. As we made our way through the first floor, we didn't encounter anything out of the ordinary. But as we climbed the stairs to the second floor, we began to hear strange noises coming from down the hallway. It sounded like footsteps, but there was no one else in the building besides us. We cautiously made our way down the hallway, shining our flashlights into each room as we passed. But the noises continued, getting louder and more frequent as we went. Eventually, we came to a locked door at the end of the hallway. It was covered in rust and had a large padlock on the outside. My friend Jack suggested that we try to pry the lock off with a crowbar he had brought along, but I had a bad feeling about the door. I suggested that we leave it alone and explore the rest of the building instead, but Jack was insistent. After a few minutes of arguing, we finally gave in to Jack's request and he began to work on the lock. As he was prying at it with the crowbar, we heard a loud clanging noise coming from inside the room. It sounded like something heavy had fallen over. Suddenly, the padlock snapped open and the door swung open on its own, revealing a dark room inside. We cautiously stepped inside, shining our flashlights around the space. It was a small room with no windows, and the walls were covered in peeling paint. But as we shone our lights around the room, we saw something that made us freeze in fear. In the center of the room was a hospital bed, and lying on top of it was the ghostly figure of a patient in a straitjacket. His eyes were sunken and hollow, and he had a look of pure terror on his face. We screamed and ran out of the room as fast as we could, making our way down the stairs and out of the building. As we hopped back through the gap in the fence and into our car, we all agreed that we would never go back to that abandoned asylum again. Looking back on that experience, I still get chills down my spine. The thought of that ghostly patient still haunts me to this day, and I'll never forget the terror that we felt in that abandoned asylum. It was a true exploring abandoned places horror story, and one that I'll never forget.
My name is Mark and I've always been fascinated by the supernatural. I've explored all sorts of abandoned places, but nothing could have prepared me for what I found in the old schoolhouse on the outskirts of town. The schoolhouse had been closed down for years, and the only thing left of it was a crumbling brick building that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. But despite its rundown appearance, I couldn't help but feel drawn to it. One night, I gathered a group of friends and we made our way to the schoolhouse, determined to explore its creepy corridors and find out if the rumors of it being haunted were true. As soon as we stepped inside, we were hit with a musty, damp smell that seemed to permeate every inch of the building. The floors were covered in debris and the walls were peeling and covered in graffiti. It was clear that no one had been inside in years. We started our exploration on the ground floor, which was mostly empty aside from a few rusted lockers and broken desks. But as we made our way up to the second floor, things started to get creepy. We heard strange noises coming from behind closed doors, like whispering and scratching. But whenever we tried to investigate, the sounds stopped. As we made our way to the third floor, things got even more intense. We heard footsteps coming from the hallway, even though no one was there. And when we tried to shine our flashlights on the source of the noise, we saw nothing. But the real terror came when we entered the old classroom on the top floor. The room was filled with old desks and chairs, and there was a chalkboard at the front of the room covered in writing that was barely visible through the thick layer of dust. As we made our way around the room, we heard something that made us freeze in fear. It sounded like someone was crying, but the sound was coming from a corner of the room that was shrouded in darkness. We slowly made our way over to the corner, shining our flashlights into the darkness. And that's when we saw her. A ghostly figure of a young girl was sitting in the corner, her knees pulled up to her chest as she sobbed silently. Her hair was long and matted, and she was wearing a tattered dress that looked like it was from a different era. We stood there frozen, unsure of what to do. But then the girl looked up at us, and we saw the terror in her eyes. We knew that we had to get out of there, and fast. We ran down the stairs as fast as we could, with the sound of the girl's crying ringing in our ears. As we burst out of the front door and into the night air, we all agreed that we would never go back to that haunted schoolhouse again. That experience has stuck with me ever since, and I still get chills down my spine when I think about that ghostly girl sitting in the corner of that classroom. It was a true exploring abandoned places horror story, and one that I'll never forget.